Good evening. I'd like to thank Stephanie Miller, who coordinates the Joan Crawford Lecture Series presentations. This is the second time I've worked with Stephanie as a JCLS presenter, and I appreciate her assistance. I'd also like to thank John Rudd, who among his seemingly thousands of duties, coordinates the technical aspects of the Joan Crawford Lecture Series. Thank you, John. Special thanks to John's marketing and creative services teammates, Hannah Sickles, Chad Yoder, David Lance, and Kelly Sisler. Also, thank you to IT Director Andy Durst for his technical assistance. As Stephanie mentioned, the Joan Crawford Lecture Series is named for the late Professor Joan Crawford. Professor Crawford's daughter, the Honorable Susie Crawford, and her husband, Roger Higgins, are here tonight. Thank you for being here. Susie and Roger are generous donors to the Garrett College Foundation and in particular to this building. My special thanks. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank my wife Donna and my youngest daughter Cassie for being here tonight. It's ironic that Cassie, who did her best not to listen to any of my historical lectures around the house, is apparently here of her own free will. My oldest daughter Lynn took the extreme measure of moving to Los Angeles to not be here tonight. If she's watching, I'm only joking, Lynn, and my best to you, Jeff and Tito. How many people here watched the three-part movie set Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox? What was special about that? What drew you in? You didn't realize this was going to be question and answer, did you? Time travel? And what happened as a result of time travel? You could change the future. And that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. Counterfactual history is really the study of how the future can be changed by changing past incidents. It's a relatively new field of study. One of the early practitioners of it was actually Winston Churchill. He wrote a 1931 essay entitled If Lee Had Won the Battle of Gettysburg. And his belief was that if you took that one incident, the Battle of Gettysburg, and you changed it to a Confederate victory, it would lead to a victory by the Confederate States of America. And in his essay, some of the unintended consequences was the British Empire ended up brokering a peace between the Confederate States and the United States. And then later, the three of them formed an English-speaking association alliance that ended up preventing World War I. So Winston Churchill took that one battle in the American Civil War and turned it into the butterflying away of World War I. And that is one of the key elements. And that is one of the key elements of the counterfactual history. Typically, one event is changed, and then historians analyze the potential effects of that change. As I mentioned, Winston Churchill was one of the people who did this initially. And a central feature was this butterfly effect, where you could make one change that might even be seemingly minor and then extrapolate it out years later to changing major events. There's a lot of topics that are common counterfactual history topics. I've listed some of them here. One of them that has been popular within the last 20 years just because of its proximity to our time frame is 9/11. Many of you probably know that there was interest among CIA leadership to have President Clinton reverse President Ford's executive order that banned political assassinations. Their view was that if that order could be lifted or modified, that Osama bin Laden could be assassinated and that one of the major terror threats of the upcoming 21st century could be avoided. President Clinton was unwilling to lift that, and one of the totally unintended consequences of his decision was 9/11. There are counterfactual historians who say if you take away bin Laden, the Twin Towers are still there, and the United States isn't tied down for 20 years in Middle Eastern wars. So that is one event of recent time that people have been very interested in. Another is Ralph Nader's run for president in 2000. Ralph Nader was a third-party candidate running an election where George Walker Bush and Albert Gore were the major party nominees. He didn't win a lot of votes percentage-wise. I think it was a little over 1% nationally, but he won thousands of votes in Florida, where the final election was decided by 500 and some votes. Almost all of those votes, most people would say, were more likely to vote for Gore than to vote for Bush had they not had the option of voting for Nader. So you have that very minor party candidate who ends up potentially changing significant American history by substituting George Bush for Albert Gore as president. There are some weaknesses to counterfactual history. One of them is overcoming the unlikeliness of an alternative outcome. Once we know how things did turn out, everything else seems unrealistic or impossible when you look at it with the advantage of hindsight. The other problem is an inability to prove a theory. Historians love citing historical documents. They love making sure that they have proper foundation for their papers and for their themes. You cannot prove a counterfactual history theme because you don't have the ability to go back and make that happen and see whether that will come true. There's also a challenge, and I'll show you an example of this later, to appropriately supporting the butterflies the further away you are from the actual event. It's fairly easy, and one example I'll give later, it's fairly easy to talk about the 1964 presidential election and what impact President Kennedy surviving would have had on that. It was just the next year. It's very much more difficult to try to extrapolate that out and say what the Democratic Party would have looked like in the 2000s had President Kennedy served 2 full 4-year terms. So that's one of the problems with counterfactual history if you try to project it out too far. There's also the issue with that it's a relatively new field in history, and it hasn't been totally accepted by all the stodgy historians who taught me that you only go on facts, and you cannot go on just facts when you're doing counter history. One of the easy things to do is to read up on counterfactual history. There are websites and websites and websites devoted to nothing but this. I've listed some of them here: Alt History Inc., Alternate History on YouTube, Alternate History Hub. You can go on there, and there are literally thousands of topics that have been had one event changed, and then the readers and the people who are posting extrapolate what might have happened as a result. I can tell you one thing, though. If you're going to post on one of those sites, you better have your stuff together, because those people love ripping each other if they don't feel like they've brought their A game to the table. I do not post. I just read a lot of it. One of the subjects that I've been most interested in looking at in counterfactual history has been the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And I think a lot of people, particularly those who lived through it, I was a very young child with I don't have any recollection of it. My parents do, a lot of their friends do, and I think the people who lived through it probably more than anyone else have done the what ifs. What if President Kennedy hadn't been assassinated? And the things that I would like to look at here would be really four: the 1964 presidential election, the civil rights legislation, the Vietnam escalation, and impact on future elections. Going back to the Kennedy assassination, the reason that I said 3 seconds that changed history, one of the Secret Service agents said it was as little as 1 second. That the time between the first shot that struck President Kennedy, which was not fatal, and the second shot that struck him, which was fatal, they had the time as Secret Service agents to have a quick conversation about, was that a firecracker? Was that car engine, car backfire? And then the second bullet struck. Many of the Secret Service agents on that detail have said if instead of having that conversation, they had immediately gone into their training with evasive action, getting out of the motorcade, speeding around, that the second bullet would not have struck President Kennedy. And several of the agents have talked about the guilt that they've felt over the years, that in many ways they felt they failed him when that was a preventable death. One of the other things that could have easily changed this event, I'm sure many of you who know about President Kennedy know he had a very bad back, and he wore that day a very stiff back harness to help with the pain. And there's a lot of conjecture that if he had not been wearing that back harness, the force of the first bullet would have pushed him down into the seat. Instead, the back harness forced him upright, which is why the second bullet was suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head on the second bullet. There's a lot of belief that had he not been wearing that day, he would have survived that assassination attempt. There was also a discussion that morning on whether the Secret Service were going to put the bubble up on the car. And what that was a bubble. It was a see-through bubble. It wasn't bullet-proof. It was bullet-resistant. And they were going to put it over the car, which they'd done on many of his other cavalcades through a city. But it was a beautiful day. They talked about it extensively. They didn't put the bubble on. And so there's a lot of belief that even that could have changed. If it didn't stop the bullet, it could change the trajectory of one or both of the bullets, which again could have made a huge difference. And then there's just if Oswald had just been a little less accurate of a shooter. I mean, he was a marksman, and and again, I'm going on the Warren Commission report. I'm just staying on that. If you listen to the Warren Commission report, of 3 bullets, you've got 2 that struck President Kennedy and 1 that actually transited through President Kennedy and struck Governor Connolly. So if you had someone who was a little less of a marksman, would it have made a difference? So I honestly think that's the easy part of this conjecture, is finding ways that President Kennedy might not have died that day. There were certainly a number of different things that could have happened. The harder part is analyzing or trying to project what might have been the result had he survived. As I said, I'd like to examine 4 things, one being the 1964 election, another Vietnam, another civil rights, and then future presidential elections. One of the first things that comes to mind about 1964 is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, might not have even been on the ticket in 1964. Those of you who remember those times may remember Bobby Baker, who was the Senate Secretary to Lyndon Johnson during his years as Senate Majority Leader, was caught up in a scandal at that point that revolved around bribery and sexual favors in exchange for congressional votes and government contracts. And in early November of 1963, there were several news organizations that were getting ready to break stories about Johnson's alleged involvement in some of this. And they weren't alleging the most recent things in the early 1960s that ended up landing Bobby Baker in jail. What they were alleging was that in the 1950s, when Johnson was Senate Majority Leader, that he made a lot of money off of working with Baker, and some of the evidence being the amount, the millions that Johnson made during the 1950s on what was a fairly meager government salary. If that had continued to come out, Johnson may very well have been dropped from the ticket by Kennedy. Once Johnson became president, the Senate committee that was investigating Bobby Baker completely shut off that part of the investigation. I think the feeling was that the country, having just gone through a presidential assassination, couldn't possibly go through potential presidential impeachment if any kind of wrongdoing was found. So that was kind of just shuttered away. But there is good evidence that at least some of Kennedy's advisors wanted Kennedy to drop Johnson from the ticket in '64. If Johnson was dumped, the question becomes who succeeds him. Three candidates who came to mind in many publications were Governor Terry, and this is clockwise from the top. Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina, Texas Governor John Connally, who ironically was the other politician in the car with Kennedy who was seriously wounded that day, and then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. So you have the potential right here for a major historical shift if Johnson isn't on the ticket. Now, what happens in 1964? Barry Goldwater was the eventual Republican nominee and was the likely Republican nominee even if Kennedy was the Democratic nominee. And they were actually looking forward to a 1964 election against each other. They had served with each other in the Senate, and even though they were from different parties and different political spheres, with Kennedy being much more liberal and Goldwater much more conservative, they enjoyed each other's company. They even talked about kind of reviving the Lincoln-Douglas type of debates where they would go around the country debating issues of the day during the '64 election. I believe that there's very little doubt Kennedy would have won this election. Right before his death, the last Gallup poll that came out had Kennedy at a 58% public approval rating. During his presidency, his average rating, public approval rating, was around 70%, which, as you know today, just thinking to the last two presidents who couldn't get their numbers out of the 30s, this is just stratospherically high. None of the 5 post-JFK presidents who won re-election in the years that followed ever had an approval rating close to this. My conservative estimate would be that Kennedy would have won somewhere between 53 and 55% of the popular vote, and about 365 to 173 in the Electoral College. I make the Electoral College, again, it's just an extrapolation on my part, but I looked at the two maps. I looked at 3 maps, actually. I looked at the 1960 presidential map where Kennedy and Johnson beat Nixon and Lodge. And then I looked at the 1964 map shown here in the upper left-hand corner where Johnson beat Goldwater. I believe if Kennedy had run, he probably would not have won as many southern states as Johnson ended up winning. Think Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, 3 states that went for Nixon in 1960 would likely have gone Republican. If Johnson were off the ticket, I think then Texas becomes problematic for the Democrats. So you can make I think even on the most conservative estimate, though, you don't see Goldwater winning anything north of Missouri and the rest of the Democratic coalition holding together. So Kennedy should have won a fairly significant victory had he been able to run for re-election in '64. Vietnam is a little harder to kind of parse together. As a little background, during the Eisenhower administration, we had less than 1,000 military advisors no ground troops in Vietnam. When Kennedy died, there were 16,000 military advisors and no ground troops there. The rapid escalation happened in the 3 years after President Kennedy's death. You had a relatively minor, in historical terms, naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin that led Congress to authorize President Johnson to basically take whatever action he felt was necessary in Vietnam. And the result of that was the first combat troops arrived in '65, and in less than 3 years we were at 463,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. So that was a major escalation. So why do I think Kennedy would not have had the same escalation? Several reasons. Kennedy developed what one historian called a, quote, healthy skepticism of military leadership. If you may recall that within months of Kennedy becoming president, he authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion or action. It was a plan that was developed during the Eisenhower administration, and the military advisors told the new president, there's no problem with this succeeding. This will be a virtual walk in the park. So of course, after that turned into a total disaster, Kennedy said he would never listen to military leaders without figuring for himself as much as he could, where the best course of action was. You could see that maturation, I guess, taking part in President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he was under significant pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to order bombing of Cuba to wipe out the Soviet missile sites there. And by not taking that advice, he may have kept us out of a World War III where both the U.S. and the Soviets had nuclear weapons. One of the things that didn't come out until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, showed some of Kennedy's wisdom here, because there were two things. One is that at the time they felt the military believed there were no operational nuclear weapons in Cuba, and there were. And number two, the commanders in Cuba had authority without going back to Moscow to launch if they were invaded. So I think the decision that Kennedy made in the Cuban Missile Crisis, while not kind of part of this presentation, certainly was a sound one. Kennedy also approved a document, NSAC 263, the month before his assassination, authorizing withdrawal of 1,000 of the 16,000 advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963. This was a recommendation from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The document also claimed, quote, the major part of the U.S. military task can be completed by the end of 1965, which not coincidentally would have been after Kennedy was safely reelected. So the Kennedy advisors, and again, hindsight is 20/20, and some Kennedy advisors would probably like to show this in the best sight possible for the president, but several of President Kennedy's advisors who wrote books after the end of the Kennedy administration said Kennedy was waiting for after the 1964 election, when he was safely reelected and would never face the voters again, and then could take the troops out of, or the military advisors out of Vietnam. So again, that's conjecture, and not everyone agrees, even not everyone who was in Kennedy's administration agrees that he would have done that, but it was a possibility. I think there are many ironies about how the civil rights movement played out as a result of Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who became president upon Kennedy's assassination, was a Southern Democrat, and for political reasons of survival in Texas, was kind of a latecomer to supporting civil rights. However, he made that his number one goal after Kennedy's assassination. This picture is from a joint session of Congress the week after President Kennedy's assassination, as is the quote. No memorial oration of eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. So there was a lot of momentum to, let's do this for President Kennedy. One of the ironies of that is that President Kennedy had kind of drug his feet on civil rights during the first 2 years of his administration. He did not fully support a Civil Rights Act until several months before his death in 1963. And there were still some people in the administration who wouldn't have minded seeing this get bottled up in Congress until after the 1964 election, because most of them realized that if this passed before 64, a lot of the South was going to be lost in the election against the Republicans. What might have happened had Kennedy lived? Some historians have estimated that the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 might have been delayed a year or two. In the long scheme of history, that's not very significant, but as many of you will recall, the summers of '65 through '68 saw major race riots in many of the big cities across the United States, and delay of this legislation could have exacerbated that situation. When we talk about the Kennedy assassination, obviously it's a national tragedy. I think sometimes we forget what a family tragedy it was. And what might it have meant if JFK had lived for his family? Well, when you talk about butterflying away events, two that might have been butterflied away would be the RFK assassination and the Chappaquiddick incident involving Teddy Kennedy. The reason I think the RFK assassination gets butterflied away in almost any situation is Robert Kennedy's course changed from supporter and advisor to the head of the family after JFK's assassination. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1964 from New York, which had never been his plan if the president had survived. And most people thought that during a second term for JFK, that RFK would serve as either Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State. So he wouldn't have had his own political base to run from in 1968. The other piece of that is kind of just the political realities. I think by that time, if John F. Kennedy had served 8 years, you're going to get to some level of Kennedy fatigue. You get to it with every two-term president. So the idea that his brother would then be able to immediately succeed him, I think would have been unlikely. A perfect example was, you had George W. Bush, who served president 2001 to 2009. A lot of people had wondered, well, why didn't Jeb run in 2008? And he felt the Bush fatigue. He's like, that wasn't the right time for another Bush to run for president, which is why he waited 8 years until 2016. So I think there's some similarities that you can see through that. What else would have changed? Well, if you go with the idea that Terry Sanford would have been JFK's second vice president, I could see Sanford and RFK as vice president beating Nixon and Agnew. Many may recall the 1968 election, Nixon had so much going in his favor. There was a war in Vietnam that was dividing the country. The Democratic Party was completely splintered. There was a third-party candidate, Governor George Wallace from Alabama, nominally a Democrat, but a segregationist, right-wing Democrat at that, and even running against an administration that had put us into a war with 500,000 U.S. troops and a bad economy and a split Democratic Party. Nixon won by about 1% of the vote. So I think if you butterfly away any of these major things, particularly the Vietnam War, you could see that the Democrats could probably have beaten Nixon in 1968. I'm going to skip through a little bit of this because I've got a slide that I think will show it a little better. But one of the things that I'm going to try to convince you, and you will see how it becomes much harder to do this the longer you go out in history, is that 6 presidents who served after JFK may never have made it to the White House. So let's give that a shot and see how that goes. There's 2 timelines here. The current timeline shows the presidents from JFK through today, and then I've created an alternate history timeline that shows presidents from JFK through today if the assassination doesn't take place. And then in parentheses, just for fun actually, I put the person I've got for vice president for the president who wins. So I mentioned to you, you've got Kennedy, he serves 2 terms. I'm saying Johnson gets done in by the Bobby Baker scandal. Sanford becomes vice president. You've got Sanford as president from 69 to 73 with Robert F. Kennedy as his running mate. I'm using a little bit of historical fact. There's only been one time period since the Eisenhower years where the same political party has won 3 straight presidential elections. And so by this point, Sanford has accomplished that with the Democrats. So my guess is that by 1972, you would have a Republican. And the most prominent Republican, if Nixon is off the board at this time, would have been Ronald Reagan. So I have, in fact, I've actually got who I've got them running against, so let me pull that up. So I have Ronald Reagan of California, governor of California at that time, and then Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford as his running mate. You will note that this gets Reagan to the presidency 8 years earlier than it does in our real-time frame. And it also gets him out of the White House before the John Hinckley assassination. So Reagan comes out pretty good in my timeline here. Then I have former Vice President Robert Kennedy, who, it's hard to believe when you think about this. At this point in time in 1980, Bobby Kennedy was still only been 55. So he would have still been a young man. I've got him coming back as president, winning the 1980 election with Senator Walter Mondale as his running mate. After Kennedy's 2 terms, Republican Kansas Senator Robert Dole and former Congressman Jack Kemp are elected in 1988. Now, this puts them as the Republican ticket 8 years before they were in 96, and it also has them winning instead of losing. So they probably like this too. I have Senator Edward Kennedy, who's, I'm going to back up for a second. One of the things that I didn't mention that I should have, that I think gets butterflied away, is Chappaquiddick. So Edward Kennedy, by 1968, was a pretty broken person. His 2 brothers who he adored had both been assassinated. He's now the head of this family. He's only 36 years old, and he ended up getting heavily into alcohol and some rather erratic behavior. And it all culminated in the accident at Chappaquiddick where he drove a car off the bridge and Mary Jo Kopechne, his passenger, died. So there were multiple issues with this. One, he didn't report the accident until the next morning, and which led people to believe, since he'd been at a party, that he might have not been in any shape to report the accident. And then the second thing is the fact that he was out very late at night with a woman who wasn't his wife, with not a great explanation. So, that really destroyed his chances of becoming president down the line. But JFK serves 2 terms. RFK still remains an older brother alive. Chappaquiddick probably doesn't happen, which to me means that Senator Edward Kennedy could very well in 1992 have become the 3rd Kennedy brother to be elected president of the United States. And I've got a young governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, as his running mate. After Kennedy's 8 years, in the election of 2000, I have John McCain winning it. And there's a couple interesting things about this. McCain ran for president in 2000, but lost the Republican primaries to George W. Bush. Well, if there was no George Bush Sr. as president, there may likely not have been a George W. Bush who was an active politician at that time or in position to run for president. So McCain may have had a much easier path to the presidential nomination in 2000. I also have Dan Quayle as his running mate. And the reason for this, and nowadays a lot of people remember Dan Quayle didn't have a real good 1988 vice presidential campaign, said a lot of things that were kind of stupid at that point in time. What people forget was prior to that, he was seen as a very studious studious Republican senator, an up-and-coming senator, a defense expert, and so with a little more seasoning, he could very well have been a politician who could become a vice president or a president later in his career. And I had President McCain defeating Vice President Clinton and his running mate, Tennessee Senator Al Gore, just for fun, but to put the Clinton-Gore team back together. I actually have Barack Obama defeating a different Clinton, former Vice President Bill Clinton, to win the 2008 Democratic presidential nominee. And as in our timeline, I've got Senator Joe Biden as his running mate. Obama-Biden defeat Quayle and former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. And then Obama-Biden win re-election in 2012 over Romney and Mike Huckabee as his running mate. Which brings us closer to present time. In 2016, in this version of history, Senator Bernie Sanders doesn't have to face Hillary Clinton since she was never First Lady, Secretary of State, or U.S. Senator from New York. And so she has a much easier time winning the nomination and selects Massachusetts Senator John Kerry as his running mate. They defeat businessman Donald Trump and Indiana Governor Mike Pence because Sanders does a better job than Clinton of securing Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by spending a lot of time in October in those battleground states, which just went to Trump by a very small margin. At 75, Sanders becomes the oldest person ever elected president, and Kerry becomes the oldest person to ever be elected vice president. And then I have Sanders in this timeline, who's credited with doing a job of providing stable leadership during COVID-19, beating Mike Pence and Maryland Governor Larry Hogan in the 2020 election. So that brings us to today, and I'm going to extrapolate even into the future past where we are now. I've got Vice President John Kerry, who would be 81 on Inauguration Day, but we're electing older presidents, so I think that's fine, is currently battling Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy Jr. for the Democratic presidential nomination. See, when JFK Sr. isn't assassinated, he convinces JFK Jr. that he would have a better chance at a political career by staying in Massachusetts rather than going to New York. So as a result of this, JFK Jr. is elected to the House of Representatives, and when Senator Ted Kennedy, his uncle, dies in 2009, he's appointed to the U.S. Senate. And by chance, since he's living in Massachusetts instead of New York, he doesn't die in a plane crash in 1999. Since President Donald Trump never became President Donald Trump, he doesn't have the stranglehold that he has today on the 2024 field. I have former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan as the front runners for the Republican nomination. And I, as you can tell, I think I had a lot of fun playing around with these lineups and seeing where things could have gone. And clearly, the longer you get into this, the less definitive you can be. It's not surprising that that's the case. It's really not surprising that the President Kennedy's assassination is the thing that people turn to about what if so much. I think everyone in this room would feel like the world would have been a better place if JFK, RFK, and JFK Jr. hadn't been taken before their time, if we hadn't lost 58,000 American lives in the Vietnam War, and if nobody ever hears about a place called Chappaquiddick. And so that's my presentation. I'm happy to either answer questions or listen to your own historical timeline deviations that you'd like to explore. That's a very fair point. And for me, when I was thinking about it, one of the things why it made sense to me is taking right or left out of it. I feel like Bernie Sanders might have been more of a unifier during the COVID pandemic. Now, he might not have been, but I think that he might have stood a better chance of having a situation where the country rallied around a president during a crisis leading to their re-election. Again, your point's just as valid, maybe more so. No, I think your point's very valid. I think the 2020 election is probably the most fluid election in history because there were things we were dealing with that we literally hadn't dealt with in 100 years. But that's a great point. It's easy. The one area where I feel like President Kennedy might have pushed back more was against the Joint Chiefs. I think Kennedy was really soured on many of them based on his experiences in both the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And ironically, I wonder what I don't know. I wonder what McNamara's position would have been if he had been the one who had ascended to the vice presidency. Whether that would have influenced Kennedy more toward staying in Vietnam or not. It might have. Yeah. One of the things I think hurt Johnson was that his experience was more on the domestic political side than foreign affairs and military affairs. And I think for those reasons, he might have leaned more heavily on the military advice that he got. And I also wonder what impact Bobby Kennedy staying in the Kennedy administration might have had on Vietnam policy. I think that might have been a stabilizing influence. There are a lot of conspiracy theories. Yeah, and that's funny because when I started going, there's a new book out by one of the Secret Service agents who's on the detail, and I started looking at it, and I was like, no. I said, I'm going to go with everything on the Warren Commission because there's just too many, you could go down too many rabbit holes, but it's very interesting. I'm going to stick to the magic bullet theory at least through the end of this hour. Michelle? Yeah, it might be that I've got the JFK Jr. timeline being too late. He might have been a 2016 candidate, which would give you 4 Kennedy presidents. Who let him in the room? No, that's a fair point. But again, there are exceptions that prove the rule. We had 20 straight years of Democratic presidents from 33 to 53. It can happen. It's just very difficult. I mean, even when you look at, we went 2 terms with Clinton, then a Republican with Bush, then Obama, then Trump. So yeah, again, that's another point that this is pushing against. One of the things about this is there's a lot of yeah buts that can come up because there are so many uncertainties. But that's a good point. Yes. And one of the interesting what ifs that would be interesting to explore is what if LBJ and RFK had had a better relationship, because RFK could have been a leveling influence on the Johnson administration, but they just hated each other so much, there's no way that was going to work out. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's very difficult, and a lot of people who do counterfactual history tend to specialize in one area or another. You know, political analysis, economic analysis, military analysis, and you know, it's not completely satisfying if you can't do all of that because they are tied all so intricately together. I think part of the things that makes the 60s such a fertile ground for this is you've got a little bit of all of this in here. You've got the political, you've got the social with the civil rights movement, you've got the military with the Vietnam War. There's a lot of that in there, but again, you're right, there's a lot of tentacles to all of this. Yeah, I've always thought that Quayle got a little bit of a bum rap. He wasn't informed by the Bush people that he was going to be the vice presidential nominee until about 48 hours before they had to go out and do it. He wasn't really prepped for that kind of an assignment, and that's a very tough environment to learn on the job. It's also so arbitrary too, because where you put a date line on, we're going to start here because of the things that precede it and come after. Yes, sir. I mean, I actually think he might have been more focused on domestic affairs if he'd come in earlier than he did. I think a lot of his campaign might have been focused more around that and the kind of the social conservative movement. But honestly, that's just a kind of top of the head view on that. Susie, I know you were in the Reagan administration. Do you have any feeling on what might on how that might impact it, or him coming in 8 years earlier? Thank you. Well, and my premise is that Kennedy gets us out of Vietnam sometime during his second term. And I think one of the interesting things that everyone was worried would happen if we did that really didn't, was the whole domino effect. Yes, there were some countries that fell to communist rule, but it didn't have the global impact that made potentially a President Johnson go, I can't pull out because I can't be the president who lost Asia. So I think if Kennedy had gotten us out, I think by the time Sanford is in, it's kind of a moot point. Whatever's happened has happened, and we've probably moved on from that. Also because we wouldn't have been as invested as I think we became in it. We became invested in it because we had nearly 60,000 people give their lives and hundreds of thousands serve there, and that made it an American loss. If we were out of there before we put combat troops in, it's more of just an American geopolitical decision on whether it was in our national security to be over there. Any other questions or comments or ideas? Yeah, I'm probably not qualified to answer that question. Ask my daughter, she sets up all my technology. One of the things that I found both interesting and depressing was the fact that we've gone from a period in the 60s where a president could have a 70% approval rating to a time period where, yeah, I mean, if you get to 50-50, you've done a great job. It's a little depressing that we're in that situation now. Well, that's why he figures prominently in my later years. I'm still pulling for him. Roger? I think the irony is one of the reasons, for me at least, it's difficult to assess what his impact's going to be is he's from a traditional Democratic family, and his views are more aligned with the Trump, on many areas, the Trump wing of the Republican Party. So I've seen articles, Real Clear Politics is a site I like to go to, because you get the left, you get the right, you get the middle, you get everything. And you've got people arguing persuasively that RFK Jr. is going to hurt Trump, and then you've got some arguing persuasively he's going to hurt Biden. I think he's that candidate who maybe end up pulling from both. You're going to have some Democrats who may think Biden's had a great first term, but just can't see somebody serving until they're 86 as president. And then you're going to have some Trump voters who believe in Trump's policies, but not the person, and might be drawn off by RFK. I think it could be a lot. I don't know if you remember back in '92 when Perot ran, the post-election analysis was he pulled about equally from Bush and Clinton. And you could have the same thing here where, RFK could pull a considerable vote, 14, 15, 16%, but if he pulls equally from both, or if you find out in polling afterwards or interviews afterwards, samples that he pulled equally from both, it may not be as big an effect as people think. I honestly think that Cornel West's candidacy has the potential to pull more votes from Biden and very few from Trump, and it could, even though he's going to win a smaller share than RFK does, it could have a bigger impact on the election. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This was fun to do, and I really appreciate your attendance and your participation.